We'll get going with the webinar right now. My name is Jeff Hovey. I'm the Vice President of the Fuels Institute, and presenting today is our Executive Director, Mr. John Eichberger. So John will talk a little bit more about some of the background on the Fuels Institute and the EV Council. I will just add at the beginning here that this is a group that has been studying and researching this transition for the past 2+ years now. And so we're really excited as John's going to pull a lot of information together here and really give us all a clear look as to what's going on. But first, some housekeeping stuff. I think John's presentation will be about 45 to 50 minutes long. But during the presentation, feel free to go up to the chat and drop in any questions. And we'll keep an eye on those and try to save some room for at the very end for some Q&A. So feel free to ask questions. If we can't get to them all, during this brief 1 hour, we'll certainly reach out to you and follow up on any type of answers that we can provide. So again, thanks everybody for joining us. And John, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon for everybody on the East Coast. Good morning, everybody on the West Coast. Titled this one called Reality of EV Transitions. And as Jeff said, I'm going to pull together a whole bunch of different data sets, most of them from us, some of them from not, but really try to provide some perspective on what's going on in the market. I think it's something that's desperately necessary as we look at how we move forward with strategies to reduce the carbon emissions from the transportation space. We need to really understand what role electric vehicles can play and how we build out infrastructure to support those vehicles as they gain market share. Quick background, we're about to celebrate our 10th anniversary. February next year, we'll be 10 years old. In that time, we've collected a board of advisors of more than 60 companies. And the reason we have such a large organization is we want to make sure that all perspectives are brought to the table. Our board represents, we have companies from the major oil companies to biofuel producers, engine manufacturers, retailers, electric vehicle equipment manufacturers and installers and operators, national lab engineers, and pretty much everybody in between. The board has the responsibilities to identify what research we do and to peer review that research to make sure that it is as objective as possible. We want to make sure that the research we put out there is something that decision makers can use to just reach more informed decisions. We do not advocate, we do not take a position on what should be done or how it should be done. We let the policymakers and stakeholders in the market decide that. Right now, the primary objective of the transportation space is directed by those leaders is to reduce carbon. So we don't get into whether that's a good thing, a bad thing, why we should, why we shouldn't. Our focus is how do we do that in a way that is effective, efficient, and provides the consumer with the greatest value as we protect the environment. So this board has responsibility for making sure we do that. As Jeff said, almost 3 years ago, we launched the Electric Vehicle Council. We recognize that there's a specific need in the market to focus on infrastructure. And some stakeholders want to focus only on electric vehicle infrastructure. They don't want to deal with some of the other fuel stuff that the Fuels Institute does. So the Electric Vehicle Council is a project of the Fuels Institute. Here is a list of those organizations that are part of it. It's about 65 different organizations. You can see, again, wide range from OEMs to utilities to retailers to equipment manufacturers, some government entities, wide stakeholders. The Electric Vehicle Council has their own authority to commission research. They will then peer review that research themselves, and then they'll send it on to the board for final peer review before publication. So the data you're seeing here has been reviewed by all these entities, and we believe that represents a really good, fair representation of what's going on in the market. So enough of that. Let's get into what I wanted to chat about. First of all, before we even get started, we have to acknowledge, yes, electric vehicles are going to play a major role in the path towards a lower carbon transportation space. We know that. That's irrefutable, and they're going to continue gaining market share. But there's a huge difference between perception and reality. And I think we've seen so much coverage of the growth of the electric vehicle market, the excitement these vehicles bring to the market, the enthusiasm, the announcements and pledges and forecasts. We've actually changed the perception, and it's not consistent with reality. A survey done just 2 months ago found that Americans believe 20% of all vehicles on the road are electric, and that 24% of those sold last year were electric. The reality is starkly different. Less than 1% of vehicles on the road in the United States have a plug, and only about 5% of vehicles sold through this year are electric, only 4% last year. So there's a huge difference. And that changes how people perceive the strategies going forward. What we really want to drive into is we need to have a balanced approach to make sure that we're matching reality with our aspirations and ensuring that consumers are taken care of throughout the process. We can do that, but it's going to be a little more messy than what we may want to see in a soundbite or a commercial. We want to make sure that we have the fundamental building blocks to create a market that result in a zero carbon transportation space in the future, and make sure that American families have the wherewithal to have access to affordable, reliable transportation when and where they need it. We published this report just about 3 months ago. We commissioned IHS Markit, now S&P Global Mobility, with doing a study on how do we deploy chargers in a way that makes most sense. The federal government has a goal of 500,000 chargers to be installed by 2030. The question is that the right number? How many do we really need? When do we need them? Where do we need them? And what kind do we need? Those are the questions we posed to S&P Global. In order to do that analysis, they had to come up with an initial forecast. So they started this project in July of 2021, and they keep reminding me, our forecast is different than this today, John. And of course it is. All forecasts and projections are outdated the second they're published, but they needed a foundation on which to start evaluating market growth. In that forecast, they projected that by 2030, maybe 17% of vehicles sold will be electric, and that's plug-in electric, plug-in hybrid and battery electric. If that's the case, their fleet turnover would get us to about 18 million vehicles on the road would have a plug, about 6% of the market. Now that contrasts with some publications released this year from major consulting firms that say we're going to get to 50% of sales by 2030. So if you think about it, we're probably somewhere in between that. Energy Information Administration is even lower than this IHS or S&P Global forecast from July 2021. So the range of expectation is quite varied. And we have to keep that in mind that there are going to be unexpected hurdles, unexpected market disruptions that will take the most optimistic forecast and really challenge that. So we need to have a pragmatic view as to where the market's going. But the study they did for us was predicated on this forecast, and I think it's extrapolable. So I think I'll talk about it a little bit. Even if the growth is faster or slower, the methodology used in this study still is relevant to help us understand when, where, and how many chargers we might need. But we also have to keep in mind that the market itself changes very slowly. If you've been in any of our webinars, any of our conferences, you've probably seen this slide and are sick and tired of seeing it. But I think it's fundamentally important to understand the size of the market. We have nearly 300 million vehicles in the United States. A couple of years ago, Bloomberg New Energy Finance came out and said they believe 60% of sales by 2040 will be a plug-in vehicle. Now, assuming that happens, we did some back-of-the-envelope calculations. Take into consideration the average sales of vehicles each year and average scrappage rate. If we were to achieve that 60% sales, we might convert maybe 27% of the vehicles on the road would be plug-in. That means that by 2040, 73% of vehicles on the road would still be combustion engine liquid fuel. Puts it in context. This is a really big market. If you think about the global market, there's 1.5 billion vehicles in the world. Converting those vehicles over is going to take time as well. So we need to really keep this in mind, keep reality in mind. Aspirations and objectives and goals are fine, but we're building an infrastructure to support consumers. We need to build it appropriately because we want to make sure that that infrastructure is self-sustaining economically, and so we don't need the government funding every step of the way. We want to make sure that there's a business case for individual businesses to say, you know what, investing in operating chargers makes sense, and I want to do it for my customers and for my business. The other part of reality we have to think about is we've seen significant growth in EV sales just the last couple of years. In 2020, battery electric vehicles are only 1.6% of light-duty vehicles sold. Through August of this year, they're at 5%. That's a huge growth rate. Now, but there's a big question mark in my mind. Can that accelerated growth rate continue? And I think what we've seen in this year with supply shortages and some price increases, I'm a little skeptical that we're going to see this straight line trajectory. I think we're going to see some slowing down, some stumbling in the growth rate as we go forward, because the reality is costs are different. For years, we were seeing forecasts that by 2025, battery electric vehicles and comparable combustion engine vehicles would have price parity without a tax credit. What we've seen this year is that's probably not going to happen. OEM after OEM had to announce increases in sales or increases in prices for their electric vehicles. Some manufacturers eliminated the lower tier of their electric vehicle offer because they couldn't afford to make them anymore. That shifted the affordability of vehicles higher. Now, according to the National Auto Dealers Association, the number one question a customer asks is, what's my monthly payment? So if you see the increase in the MSRP go up, that monthly payment's going to go up too. So now you're starting to create a distance incentive for consumers to think about it. The Inflation Reduction Act was greeted with a lot of fanfare because it opened up the tax credit to all OEMs. The problem is there's a provision in there on the Assemble in America and American materials that limit the number of vehicles that are going to be qualified for the full credit next year. I've seen 2 or 3 analyses that say maybe 3 or 5 models next year and the following year will qualify for the full tax credit. What this means is the IRA for the next couple of years has minimized the incentive, reduced the incentive while prices went up. That change in acquisition costs could slow down the rate of adoption. Now, for those who are anti-EV, that doesn't mean that you were right and EVs are a fad that are going away. They're not going away. They're going to continue to grow market share, but it's not going to be that straight line trajectory that some have projected. And that means that these forecasts for extensive market turnover in the next 5 to 10 years may not come to fruition. And we just need to recognize that. It's not saying that EVs are going to struggle long term, but they're going to have a challenge until the economics come back into line with what consumers are looking for when they go to purchase a vehicle. There's been a lot of discussion about the medium and heavy duty market and the conversion of those vehicles to electric powertrains as well. This actually represents a higher hurdle to overcome. Right now, as in 2020, the number of commercial vehicles that were gasoline or diesel powered totaled 99.5% of the vehicles in operation. So we have a very small percentage of vehicles that are operated on anything other than diesel or gasoline. When we think about the projection on that, this is a global forecast. According to the data Statista analyzed, by 2026, they project that 325,000 commercial vehicles in the world will be zero emission vehicle, which is a battery electric vehicle, plug-in hybrid, or hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle. 325,000. Compare that to the fact that we sell 22 million units every year. It's a very small percentage. That does not mean we're not going to see more commercial vehicles electrify over the next several years. We will. There's a lot of application where it makes a lot of sense. For example, parcel delivery services that travel a designated route each day, maybe 100 miles, a lot of stop start. They go back to a Home Depot at night to charge in, not the Home Depot store, but the depot, the parcel delivery service to charge. Makes a lot of sense, both from an environmental perspective and an economic perspective. But in the big picture, it's a very slow transition. It's going to be much more challenging. We did a paper earlier this year that kind of classified 17 different categories of vehicle applications in the medium and heavy duty market. They're not all the same. It's a very diverse market that's going to require specialized solutions and customized solutions for each vehicle and each vehicle use to maximize our ability to reduce carbon emissions. So we need to recognize that the transition to heavy duty or medium duty electric vehicles is going to be slower than that for light duty vehicles, and we need to build accordingly. Why is that market growing more slowly? Because the economics are just not there yet. These two charts might be a little difficult to see on a small screen, but basically it shows that a medium duty truck that's EV compared to diesel in 2025 would be twice as expensive, and the heavy duty side's 2.5 times as expensive. It's really fundamental. When you're a commercial operator, you're looking at your total cost of ownership, your return on investment. The acquisition of the vehicle is so much higher than your traditional vehicle, and you cannot calculate out your savings on energy, chances are you're not going to buy the vehicle. So we need to continue making progress in battery efficiency and engine design and vehicle design to bring those costs back down into a comparable place. And then the businesses will be able to make that economic decision. So you know what? Not only do I want to contribute to a decarbonization strategy, I also want to reduce my cost of operation, and this vehicle makes sense. At that point, we'll see the electric vehicle market and the medium and heavy duty space accelerate beyond what we've seen to date. We also need to think about what the overall environmental impact is. The advocacy for electric vehicles, because they have no tailpipe and they're ostensibly they're defined as a zero emission vehicle. When we think about the life cycle, however, they're not zero emission. They are lower emission. So we published a paper in January comparing the life cycle carbon intensity of internal combustion engines, hybrids, and battery electric vehicles over 200,000-mile life expectancy. And this is modeled on a basic sport utility, crossover utility vehicle. And you see here that the battery electric vehicle is actually 41% lower carbon emissions over its life cycle compared to combustion engine, and the hybrid electric vehicle is 29% lower carbon. This is important. The challenge we got to think about, though, is 72% of the emissions of an electric vehicle come from electricity generation. And this average is based upon if we had an average US electricity mix. That doesn't exist. A friend of mine reached out to me and said, there's no such thing as an average utility mix. Absolutely correct. But you need a benchmark. So this is the benchmark if we average it. However, when we look at it from a more diverse perspective of what the energy profile of the United States looks like, we see that there are markets where it makes more sense to deploy EVs for an environmental purpose, and some markets where it doesn't make as much sense. So if you're in a very low carbon grid, a lot of renewable energy, the carbon benefit of an electric vehicle is 73% advantageous versus an internal combustion engine. But if you're in a extremely high carbon grid, a lot of coal-fired power plants, over 200,000 miles, the electric vehicle actually emits 16% more carbon over its life cycle than the internal combustion engine. This is not saying that the grid's not going to get cleaner, that things are going to get better. This is just saying that we need to pay attention to where the EVs are being deployed so we can capitalize on their benefits and minimize any negatives that may come from it. We want to make sure that we are deploying solutions that make sense for the environment and for consumers. Now, keeping this in mind, we need to think about once somebody buys an EV, how are they going to charge it? And the EV Council's primary purpose is to look at infrastructure and try to figure out how we're going to build infrastructure to support the needs of the growing electric vehicle market. These two maps come from the S&P Global Mobility study I referenced earlier. I think it's really fascinating when we think about the geographic distribution of electric vehicles. According to IHS Markit, S&P Global, in 2021, 82% of all EVs were registered in 15 states. California was sitting at more than 40% market share. Now, you forecast out to 2030 with their 18 million vehicles in the market and their census tract analyses, and they say that the concentration, the top 15 states, the 15 states will change. See Oregon and Washington disappear from the 2030 map, and a couple others pop up. But we're still going to see a concentration level of 76% in just 15 states. California's contribution drops down to 25. So you're seeing more vehicles in Texas and Florida, in New Jersey, New York, but we're still seeing a heavy concentration of vehicles in a limited number of states. So when we start thinking about the $7.5 billion the federal government's investing in infrastructure, start thinking about the money we want to invest as businesses or investment firms, think about where the demand's going to be. So when I mentioned when we commissioned the study, we wanted to know how many chargers we might need and where we might need them. So based upon this analysis, what S&P did is they took a census tract basis. For every census tract unit in the country, they looked at what is the EV concentration, what's the current EVSC population, what's the housing mix, what's the miles traveled, parking habits, economics, educational level. There's several different factors to start prioritizing where EV chargers will be needed in the next 10 years. And you take a look here, they created a scale of 1 to 4 priority, California being 1. California's already congested. There's more vehicles and chargers than we're ideally looking for. And then I look at some of the other states to find out where we need to really invest money. This is not to say that, the dark states don't need any chargers, but when we're looking at how to prioritize our attention, they may not need to be at the highest level of prioritization. The need for the market, the need to support consumers can be higher in the lighter colored states. It's just another way of looking at it. And I talked to another person from the EVC, said, our prioritization is very different. Of course, everybody's prioritization can be very different. What this demonstrates, though, is we need to look at the actual market-specific conditions to decide where it makes most sense to invest our money in charging infrastructure. Given that, how did they do the analysis? They used the international benchmark. About 10 to 11 vehicles per charger is ideal. Anything above 15 is considered congested. So we're really looking at 10.5 vehicles per charger. If their forecast is accurate, and there's 18 million electric vehicles in the market by 2030, that ratio means we're going to need about 1.7 million chargers. Now, the federal government's goal is 500,000 chargers by 2030. This is an order of magnitude 3x. Now, if you are looking at a forecast that's more 50% of sales by 2030, that base number of vehicles in operations can be much higher than 18 million. So you're going to need an incrementally higher number of chargers. Now, the difference is they are suggesting in this analysis that we could possibly satisfy that demand with 90 to 95% of level 2 chargers, and the rest being DC fast chargers. And they did that because when they did the census tract analysis, they also analyzed cell phone ping data to figure out where people are spending the majority of their time. How long are their vehicles sedentary? How long are they parked somewhere? And if we can strategically target the installation of level 2 chargers where customers are going to be parked for a long period of time, then we can capitalize on the lower cost of installation, the lower need for high-powered electricity in those markets, and then concentrate our economics investment to those areas where DC fast chargers are essential for commuting routes, for long-haul interstate corridors, for communities near multi-unit dwellings where they don't have access to sufficient charging infrastructure at their homes, areas where that DC fast charging amenity and convenience is going to be extremely valuable. And then we provide the opportunity charging where people are going to be hanging out long-term anyway. So it's a way of looking at it and being much more strategic about our approach. And the way they got to this is they really looked at those census tracts. To demonstrate the methodology, they did 3 case studies: Detroit, Dallas, and Portland, Oregon. And here's a snapshot of some of the graphics and analyses they did for Detroit. But they really looked at each community to find out, okay, where are people living? Where are the cars? Where are the EVs registered? Where are EV chargers existing? Where do people spend time to really customize for these markets where investment in charging is going to make the most value for the market and create a return on investment for the site operator? This is the type of analytical approach that I think would result in a very smart deployment strategy, an effective deployment strategy. It would help us maximize the utilization and value of taxpayer dollar investments, as well as create market incentives for businesses to invest their own money to operate these stations. If we can balance that out and create that business case by being very specific and very strategic of our deployment capabilities, then I think we have an opportunity to really develop a robust infrastructure that is going to be valuable for the drivers and the communities being served, as well as those investing their money to operate them. So that's the kind of the summary of the S&P study on how many do we need, when, where, and what kind. But we've also done some studies this year that we published earlier this year and just a month or so ago, looking at the role of government and how the government can help support the development of charging infrastructure. We knew that the government was going to be investing several $1 billion into infrastructure. So we commissioned ICF to do the first study we published this spring, looking at past policy experience. We believe that the past is a great lesson to help guide better decisions going forward. We asked them to take a look at the last 5 years, what programs, incentives, and policies were in place to encourage EV charging installation, which ones were successful, which combinations were successful, which ones weren't so successful, what lessons could we learn from those experiences. They did statistical analysis. They also talked to program participants and program administrators to find out what elements of different programs seem to work the best. You know, it's interesting, policymakers who are elected set policies and strategies and they deploy them, and then the regulatory officials and the people boots on the ground have to implement them. And when you ask the people who actually have to implement them how they feel about the policy, they give you very different perspective than the people who drafted the policy. And I think we need to listen to them, because they may say, you know, why did they do it this way? We could have done it this way much more efficiently. We need to learn from those who are actually hands-on so that we can improve the policies going forward and let the policies and the market work well together efficiently and effectively to deliver our objectives. What we found was that markets that had more policies that were related to charging and EVs seem to have higher market development scores for electric vehicle charging stations. For example, if you have a state or a jurisdiction that has a program on alternative energy, has a program on incentives for EVSE, but also has additional tax credits for EVs, or it has some sort of climate change, renewable energy portfolio standard, those all combine to provide a lot of incentive to increase the number of EV charging in the market. One of the things that came out of it was they looked at demand charges, and demand charges are a significant challenge to operating profitability, but they found that it wasn't really a disincentive to the installation of chargers. But when they did another look at it, they realized, well, a lot of the markets where demand charges were a little higher were in markets where there were a lot of other incentives. So the other programs may have offset some of those operational financial hurdles that were perceived as a challenge. So understanding the dynamics of different policies and different market forces will really help us understand how we can structure future policies to really support market development. Financial investment's key, and that's one of the reasons why $7.5 billion are being invested from the federal government. We found a correlation of about 26%. That public funding really accounts for variation in charging station development across the states in different markets. So those areas where had more investment from the government were more likely to have more charging stations. I think it's really important, however, that the capital investment in installing a charger is only part of the equation. Yeah, it can be an expensive part, especially if you're doing a robust DC fast charging station, but the operating expenses and the operating capital that's necessary to receive the electricity and distribute electricity is very important as well. So we need to balance all that out. And if you're a retailer or business trying to think about how to get into the business, there's a lot of questions. You know, do you go ahead and install your own charging station, operate yourself, or do you contract a third party to bring their solution to your market? They take care of a lot of the expenses and complications, but then you're having somebody else run the charging stations on your property. That's up to the business to decide what makes sense. How much will it cost? Should I pursue NEVI funding? Can I even get funding from the NEVI program? How much power do I need? And, you know, do I want level 2? Do I want 50 kilowatt chargers, 150 kilowatt chargers? How many charging units do I need? All these questions come through. Where do I locate them? How can I make money on this? What's my utility rate? What's my demand charge? And if you get to the point you're asking what's your demand charge, now you've really gone down the path, because you've already established that, okay, I want to get into this business. I want to make it work. Now I got to figure out how I'm going to pencil out to make it actually make economic sense. And you see here, there's 4 papers here. Predominantly, 2 of them are written for traditional convenience fuel retailers on retrofit and future proofing. But the first 2, the first one, this is installing and operating public electric vehicle charging infrastructure. That was designed to be a handbook from point A to point B. You start off with, I think I may want to get into this business. What questions do I need to ask? And it walks you through the decision tree until you actually flip the switch and turn on power. Great resource to provide the interested participant a great guide to figure out how to get into the business. And then the charger deployment optimization I've already gone through pretty extensively. But through that, you know, what are demand charges? So they can be vilified by the people trying to operate charging. Basically, demand charges are a fee that the utilities charge to ensure they're delivering enough power to satisfy your maximum consumption at any one point. The challenge is the utility rate structure was really not designed for retail transactions like the EV charging. They were designed for more industrial purposes, more consistent power draw. And so they create a disincentive from an economic, because they could create a utility fee on a monthly basis that eclipse the potential revenue from the charger. In our publication earlier this year that ICF put together for us, they pulled these charts that came from a report from the Great Plains Institute. And it shows that along the x-axis is your demand charge per kilowatt hour, and up the other side is your energy charge per kilowatt hour. And you're looking at 10 charging events a day per unit for 50 kilowatts, 150, 350, and 450. Green indicates you're making money. There's a profitability there. Red indicates you're not. This is a challenge. In our interviews, we found several people pointing this out. One said it's the biggest existential threat to the economic viability. Now, there are political fights going on about this. My comment on demand charges is they are a challenge. I think the utility industry has recognized that. Several have implemented different policies and strategies to try to mitigate the disincentive that demand charges may have on profitable EVSE installation. There are retailers out there doing different things to try to manage the demand charges from their side. We are going to be reviewing just this week. The Electric Vehicle Council will review 5 different proposals to commission a comprehensive evaluation of how can we mitigate demand charges in a long-term fashion that does not hurt the utilities, but supports the utilities' economic structure, the retailer's economic structure, and the consumer's economic needs. We need to have a sustainable solution, sustainable being long-term, in order to develop a market where the EV charging can deliver a business value to those businesses that want to operate them. We published another paper just recently called the Best Practice Guide for EVSE Regulations. And between this one and the ICF paper earlier this year, tons of great insights. We interviewed dozens of stakeholders who are actively engaged in installing and operating EV chargers, in dealing with local regulatory officials. What we found in a couple of previous papers is that local regulatory structure is not necessarily adaptable yet for EVSE, not in all markets. There are, it's a very nascent industry, and there are a lot of regulatory structures at the local level that just don't understand and aren't accommodating to what the EVSE requirements are. I heard one person say, look, I went in to get a permit to put in chargers, and it was the same regulatory process I had to go through to put in underground storage tanks for my petroleum station. That's not necessarily a good thing. What we wanted to find out is how can we provide government officials with some insights to streamline that process, to make it easier, to get rid of that hurdle. Another example is there's a station just down the street from me that put in 4 DC fast chargers. I saw them go up at the store, and I kept watching to see who was using them. They weren't using them. I talked to the company and said it took them 9 months from the time they finished construction to finalize the permit process to get the power turned on so they could sell electrons. There's a lot of challenges there. So what I want to do is walk through some of the high-level summaries that came out of that. First, I want to point to this study from Rocky Mountain Institute in January 2019. I encourage you to look at it. It's a great study on how to accelerate the economic viability of charging infrastructure. And this chart, this graphic, I think really demonstrates that soft costs, not the equipment, not the construction, not the engineering, soft costs represent so much of the cost of the installation of a charging station. That includes delays in permitting, delays in zoning and authorities, all that red tape that has to be done before you can actually get into the business. It's a huge challenge. And so our studies have been focused on how can we streamline that, how can we make that better? So combining some of the results from the earlier report and this latest one, clear, coherent guidance from the highest levels of government down through the authorities having jurisdiction creates coordination, creates a commitment to achieving an objective, gets everybody lined up. That leadership from above is really important. And then we need to coordinate policies among jurisdictions. I deal a lot with the convenience fuel retailing industry. When they're building out their sites, they develop a model for a store, and they have all the economics, they have all the numbers, they have all the construction costs. They know exactly what it's going to take to build that format store. And they'll go out and they buy land and they want to plop that plan in that land. Then they go to next county, they want to plot that same structure. But because the different jurisdictions are dealing with EVs charging stations differently, they have to re-engineer and re-architect their plans. Really creates an economic disincentive and really eliminates that economy of scale advantage they're trying to replicate with putting in the same format everywhere they go. The stakeholders, and they're bulleted out here, streamline and simplify the application process. Have one application for all permits. Have those permits clearly articulate in the application process what documents are necessary. So there's no 2-week delays. Oh, we need this document from you. Submit that document. Okay, we need this document from you. Get them all lined up so they're all submitted at one time. And then try to do concurrent permit reviews rather than sequential. That can tighten up the timeline very, very well. Have somebody designated to be the point person to help people manage the EVSE application process. Have an online application. Maybe allow for some webinars for interested parties to walk them through ahead of time what's going to be expected and required of them going forward. When we get into specific recommendations, you see a whole bunch here, and this is just a high-level summary. Enforce turnaround times so that we're actually making approvals in a timely manner, expedite review process, permitting point person, classify EV charging stations as an accessory use to the site that doesn't require additional massive permitting. Some places have done that. It's been very effective. Require only an electrical permit. Application one department, pre-application meetings. You can take a look at this. The slides will be available for you afterwards, but also all this information is detailed in much more detail in the reports themselves. I'm just trying to give you a high-level sampling of what we've put in there. The other thing was we received a lot of recommendations with regard to utilities. We have to deal with easement. And so if we could figure out some special easement considerations, that'd be really helpful. If we can open up some of the funds, or at least the authorities, to allow utilities to provide make-ready services, that means they're preparing a site for eventual EVSE installation. Maybe that site's not ready to put in charger because the demand is not ready yet. There's no economic value to do so, but they're doing some construction anyway, so they want to go ahead and get it set up. We need to authorize that, make that a viable option for the utility and the potential site host to work together to lay the foundation so that when the time is right, those chargers can go into the lowest cost possible. We need additional visibility to where power is available on the grid. Just because I have a site doesn't mean I have enough power to support 450 kilowatt chargers. And I've spoken with some of our utility partners and they've told me, John, we are 12, 24, sometimes longer months out from a time a customer says, I need more power for EV charging station until we can actually bring the construction engineers and power service to the location. We need to figure out and try to optimize putting stations in where that power already exists, and then figure out a way to accelerate the availability of power delivery to other sites that might be very optimal for servicing customers, but don't have the power coming in. Put it in context. If you want to put in 450 kilowatt charge, that's 600 kilowatts of power. Your typical Whole Foods grocery store operates on 400 kilowatts of power. That's a lot of power. And so we need to recognize that, and we need to be cognizant of the lead times that the utilities need to provide that service. They can, they will, but it's going to take some time, and they have to prioritize the resources they can allocate to the delivery of power. But knowing where the power is on the grid can help us shortcut that and put the chargers where the power already exists. Dedicated design and construction staff at the utility who can coordinate with potential site hosts to really facilitate the transition in the market, and then to streamline the design approval. So there's a lot of things in here that can be done without legislation, without federal regulation. We just need to be smart about it. And what I encourage local regulatory officials and utilities and potential site hosts, start talking to each other now. Talk about what you need, what you don't need, what works, what doesn't work. Use our resources as guides. We've tried to aggregate a lot of that knowledge to make it easier for you. But I think the coordination, the communication is so critical to make this process more efficient. And then finally, I'll point out these resources that I've been talking about. The handbook is on the far right. The policy experience is the second from the right, charger deployment optimization, and then EVSE best practices for regulations. We have our demand charge mitigation study going to be kicked off here pretty soon. We're going to be doing a survey of North American and European EV drivers and EV site host operators to find out what's going on. What are they thinking about? What are their experiences like? How is the European experience like or different from the US North American experience? And use that information to help guide development of a market that really serves the needs of both the site host and the consumer. If we can do that, we can create a real robust market and deliver the incentives to really get industry and businesses to invest their own capital to service our customers going forward. And with that, I will open up to any questions that may be coming in, Jeff.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. That's a lot of information, everybody. And again, thanks for joining us. I will just kind of summarize some of the big things that John mentioned that we see as we work with the Department of Energy and industry. This is a huge lift, and I don't think we can understate that. We are bringing together investor-owned utilities, rural cooperatives, municipal utilities that aren't used to working with the consumer in this manner and we're bringing that group together with folks that have made a living off from doing this, right? That's what they do. They serve the consumer, through retail transactions and in other fashions. So, both sides are really trying to understand how the other operates, and it's not been an easy path. So everybody's on this huge learning curve, and so it's been really exciting for us to jump into all of these issues. And really, as the issues pop up, sometimes there are rumors that need to get dispelled, or they are really pertinent questions. And there's a couple. There's one right now that was asked as far as, how do you make this the charging as a service? How do you make money off from it? And so we spent a lot of time talking about charging session. How do you shave off those peak demand charges with either distributed energy, battery storage? So everything is really on the table right now as far as, how do you make this a good business opportunity so that industry can pick this up and run with it. To John's great point, this is not a job where the government should be having to continue to support this. I mean, obviously, this initial support through the NEVI program and the other funding coming out is critical, but at some point this needs to be sustainable. And so there's a lot of discussions going on about that right now. So so one of the questions coming in, and I'll just lead with that one, John, is there a solutions for making EV chargers profitable for retailers? And is it a good idea for retailers to install electric vehicle charging stations at this point in time? So what are some of the things that we're hearing?
I think the most critical thing is there's no one answer to that. It depends. And what I advise business owners when they ask me that question is, what's going on in your market? Yeah, you can look at the national trends, state level trends, but in your market, your customers, are they driving electric vehicles? Are you seeing them? Is anybody else putting in chargers? What is happening in your local service area? That's going to dictate whether or not you're going to have demand for chargers at your site. Now, you can look at trends in neighboring communities as well, and that can help give you some insights what the future might look like. But that's really the critical elements. Who are your customers? What are they driving? What do you think they're going to be driving in the next couple of years? And what do they need? What do you have to do to support them? In terms of profitability, there's a variety of combinations that go into that. The demand charge situation is really a really significant hurdle. We do know that the more transactions you have on a given charger station, charger pedestal, the easier it is to generate a return on investment. Depending on what business you're operating, what kind of dwell time can you capitalize on while they're inside your place of business? Can you capitalize on them being there a little bit longer? Does that make sense? Does the EV charging post provide a draw for more customers to come to your facility? Those all go into it. You really need to think about what's your investment profile and what is your customer profile. You also need to think about what type of power do you need. If I'm located in a quiet suburban community where most people are driving 25, 30 miles a day, most of them have at-home charging capabilities, I probably don't need a really high-speed DC fast charger. I might need a moderate speed DC fast charger to give them recharge opportunities that's convenient, on demand. But that power delivery that you're doing, the way you're bringing the power to your market can influence your economics as well. And there are solutions that allow you to bypass demand charges, and they may provide you the service your customers need. You may need to provide service beyond that your customers need. So it really depends on your individual conditions and circumstances.
Yeah, I think another point as the Fuels Institute starts to work with a lot of fleet operators too, typically the fleets are, talking about electrification or other low carbon fuels more so on a hub and spoke, return to base type relationship. So, but eventually they want those vehicles on the road longer and for more miles. That's how they make money. So if you've got or in the proximity where you see other fleets doing this and you want to extend their range and sit down and talk with those operators, there are probably other opportunities out there that will come up. And then of course, there's some really exciting stuff going on when we start talking about vehicle to grid technologies, and how can that help our ROI in the longer run. But lots of stuff on the horizon. Here's another good question, John. Basically, there was a there. I think the question is, there's a large cross section of consumers who simply are not ready to jump into the electrification mode. And so I think that could be anybody from rural America to those that see their driving patterns. They just absolutely have to drive long distances, maybe is the point. But what needs to happen with the educating the consumer as to when is a good time to look at an electric vehicle? When does it fit? What goes into that education process? I know we've been spending some time on that.
I think there's a variety. I think what we've seen to date is those who purchase them are kind of the first movers. Their technology, they love technology. They want to be progressive, environmental. They have lifestyles that allow them to do this. As we look at mass adoption, there's several things that have to come in. What is the drivers, a customer's actual mobility needs? Look, Americans are notorious for buying way beyond their needs. I bought so many pickup trucks in my life, and the question is, what's the tow capacity? What's the power? Well, what are you pulling? Well, I don't have anything to pull yet, but if I ever do, I want to make sure I have maximum tow capacity. Same thing with range. How many people drive 300 miles without taking a 30-minute break? But our mindset is we need the maximum. We need the worst case scenario solved. We need to change that mindset. We need to change the mindset that you're going to need to charge in the public all the time. If you have a home, you can charge at home and replenish your 20, 30 miles a day pretty easily. But I think what it comes down to, there are those who are never going to want to buy an EV, and that's okay. We have to recognize that there's certain lifestyles, certain personalities, certain applications, especially in the commercial vehicle world, where electrified powertrains may not be the solution that fits the needs best. It doesn't mean we don't find lower carbon options for those customers, but we need to be pragmatic about it. I got into a debate with a guy a couple of years ago. I said, well, John, once EVs are cost competitive on purchase, we know the total cost of ownership is lower, everybody's going to buy one. That's not true. People will change things when there's a discernible benefit. One of the things that I think EVs are struggling with is they don't really provide much benefit. Total cost of ownership, yes. Not having to go to the gas station, yes. But in terms of tangible, improve my life and convince me irrefutably to replace the vehicle I have and I've driven for years with something new, is more of a leap of faith at this point. As economics change, that rationale will change. The other thing is, if I'm a family of 4 and I've got a busy social schedule, especially on the weekends, I may not know if there's chargers in my community. We know that once you buy an EV, finding EV chargers is pretty easy because your computer has a database. But for those that don't, if we want to encourage them to buy EVs, those chargers need to be in their face every single day so that they never have to question, is there enough charging capacity in my community? So I think there's a lot of things that go into it, but we have to recognize that it may not be for everybody.
Right. Yeah. And recognize the fact that we've got multiple consumer types, right? Spend a lot of time talking about the individual user versus the fleet operator. And this week I had some conversations with some folks representing a fleet, and they looked at the economics and they went, okay, we can make this work. It pencils out, we can, and they were ready to pull the trigger on it, but yet they hadn't talked to their utility provider yet too. So we say it all the time. If the path you want to go down, number one, go to our website, pull up that checklist of best practices on what to do first, and then it'll walk you all the way through it. It's available to anybody, and it's a great checklist. And then of course the first thing is contact your utility provider to see what type of power you have there. And you kind of touched on one of the next questions here is, what are we looking at for home charging? And a few years ago, it was estimated that 85% of all charging was done at home. My guess is a few years ago, it was probably even higher than that. But now as we start to see more availability out here, giving the consumer more flexibility in where they're going and where they're traveling to, and changing some of those behavioral patterns, they're getting used to it. And so again, I think you're right on point that they have to be visible. But I don't know that I've seen another number as far as what percent of EV owners are charging at home. I know we've got some new survey stuff coming out that we're going to be working on that. So we will be looking at that.
I think everybody's still batting around the 80 to 85% of charging occurs at home or at the office. But there's other data points to think about. I think it's close to half of Americans may not have access to off-street parking or garage parking. That changes dynamics. I was talking to somebody just the other day that if they live in Manhattan, they're not running a power cord out of their third floor apartment down to the street, down the road to plug in a car. They don't have the opportunity. And so we have to look at the housing complex. We have to look at the communities that we are servicing. There are more and more regulations saying that apartment complexes need to convert 10% of parking spots to be have chargers. That's fine. That's progress. But it means 90% of the parking spaces and 90% of the residents may not have access. So I think as we get to more mass adoption and the demographics of the EV driver come consistent with that of every other driver out there, we're going to see a lower reliance on at-home charging and a higher reliance on in-market charging, which is why we need to build the infrastructure to support those customers if and when they decide to purchase an electric vehicle.
Yeah. Okay, next question. This is a good question because you touched on this really big need for standard practices at the utility level when it comes to permitting processes and the bureaucracy that we walk through, and again, somehow creating some type of standard practices that apply to investor-owned utilities all the way down to rural cooperative utilities. Right, we got 3,000 utilities here. And we're asking for some standard practices to streamline. There's another set of standards that are going to be more downstream that we're looking at right now, and that comes in NFPA 30A for the site host and the retailer. And I will say that the question is, have we really looked at what's going on with NFPA, which is the fire code for a lot of authorities having jurisdiction, and how do the high-powered chargers sit on a site in relationship to fuel dispensers and right-of-ways and things of that nature? So it's standards all around. I mean, that we're really looking for. This is like John said, this is such a nascent, endeavor that we're all learning as we go here. John, have you heard anything else on what's going on with NFPA for the site host?
Yeah, so there's a pretty big debate going on there. Fire Protection Association is their mission is to make sure that things are safe, to make sure there's no high risk of combustion activity at any location where people may be. And there's a process in place where they're trying to figure out what is the fire risk of a charging stations in proximity to petroleum refueling stations and that equipment. And the debate is how far apart must they be to minimize the risk of fire. That includes from which point of a charging site do you measure? Is it from the pedestal? Is it from the controller? Is it from the edge of the parking space? Those details are what's being debated. I think nobody questions that we need to have safe protocols and safe standards, and the question is, what is the definition? How safe is safe? What's overkill? What's underkill? I think the risk we run into right now is because this is not confirmed and not finalized, will there have to be retrofits? Will things have to be moved once an FPA is done? Don't know. Don't know how they're going to address that. I think we should know a little bit more after the first year is my hope.
Yeah. And there's what's going in the ground now versus what's coming under the NEVI program, right? Under this whole umbrella of rules. And that kind of gets into like the next couple of questions is it going to be easy for the consumer to go up and have an exchange or to use a universal payment process so that it's it's seamless for the consumer. And how is that going to relate to the equipment that's already out there versus equipment that's coming in under the NEVI program that has a strict set of guidelines for it must be a universal, opportunity for the consumer. I'm, I think I don't know. I'm going to leave it at that, John. What are your thoughts on let's just say the equipment that's out there right now, where it's kind of the Wild West. There's different payment programs.
It is the Wild West, and that's because we're early on. Think about any emerging system, any emerging technology. You have multiple standards. We had beta VHS. Are you going to go with the iPod or the Zune? What are you going to use? What's going to win? I think we have to recognize that I think some people assume that EV drivers are technologically savvy. Yeah, we want everybody to be a driver of an EV. That doesn't work. There are some people who don't know how to use smartphones and don't want to use smartphones. So app-based payment may not work. Plug-in charge is kind of the ideal, but that standard hasn't been written yet either. And then how do you do that with multiple OEM units being delivered to the market? I think, having some physical payment technology opportunity is important, but I think for now we're going to see multiple platforms. And I think it's going to take some time. There are so many players in the EV charging space. Consolidation is bound to happen. And I think once we get to that consolidation time frame, these things are going to start becoming much more clear, much more simple. Then the standards can take place. But the discussion on standardization is happening all the time. I think there's just too many players right now to really come up with a standard that's going to work for everybody. But I think the focus is ensure all drivers have the option to drive an EV and use public charging. And if we keep that as the primary objective, not the I want my system to win, then we can find a standard that works for everybody.
Yeah. And during the process, let's try to keep it as simple as possible. And,
Right.
we know that there's some states out there that have implemented, or in next year, they'll come to fruition, a tax on electrons for public charging. And how are you going to apply that, right? I'm not sure if these rules will stand the test of time, but we're not at that point right now where we should be trying to overcomplicate this.
Right.
And so, okay. Next question. This will be the last one. We'll wrap up with this one. Why won't the government step in to minimize impact of demand charges? I've heard of some marketers shutting off their chargers because of lack of profitability associated with demand charges. And we spend we bring this up, so we're in a couple of different working groups, either with industry or with government agencies, where this is a big discussion. And again, we've got a whole research piece that we're bringing our task force together right now, our industry leaders, to tackle this issue. And hopefully the result is that we get some good information out there from multiple different utilities, multiple different types of utilities, and we can help policymakers out with some of these issues. John, what are your thoughts?
I think that the challenge is, what is the solution? Demand charges have a role. They're important. They're part of the structure of the utilities service provision to make sure they're providing enough power where it needs to be. And so the demand charges were designed to help make sure capacity was what the customer needed. There are more than 3,000 utilities, each with a different rate setting process, each with a different rate package. I think demand charges are the tip of the spear, but fundamentally we need to rethink the utility regulatory system as it applies to EV chargers. But to go to the government and say, we want this solution, that we don't know what a solution is. And we'd have to evaluate what is the federal government's authority to dictate, for example, to a rural electrical co-op, which is owned by its customers, you have to do this. Don't know what their authority there is. So as you said, Jeff, the goal is through this paper is we come up with a couple options that seem to be viable from all stakeholders' perspectives. And then stakeholders can maybe go to FERC and say, hey, can you help us kind of roll this out? Can you help us share this with the utilities? Maybe go to NARUC, the utility commissioners, and share it with them. And we'll take the report and share it with as many people as we can as well. But if we can get the utility industry and the EV charging host community to coalesce around a couple options that seem to make sense, that's when you can enact change. If the utilities and the charging hosts hold hands and go to the commissioners and the regulatory authorities with this is what we agree to be a viable solution, then I see resolution. Until you get to that point, the regulators are going to keep fighting it out, guys. And unfortunately, the fight's gotten kind of nasty. So hopefully we can find some solutions that really make sense for all parties involved, including the customer.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know there's a lot of very progressive utilities that are coming out saying, look, we know, based upon the rules we have to operate under, we're very slow, and as part of the utility board process and the rulemaking process on setting rates, and they don't want to be that slow, right? Because they're watching industry saying, okay, if it's going to take this long, we need to start thinking of, battery storage to shave off that peak. We need to think of solar if you've got the real estate footprint, for a massive amount of solar, but it's all, these other possibilities are coming out. And I think some of the utilities feel like, wow, we are, if we keep operating this slow, we're going to get passed up. And so they really want to help and they want to play a role in this, but they're kind of tied down. So it's going to be interesting.
That's a great point, Jeff. We're entering the Christmas season, so Charlie Brown Christmas is always in my head. The fact that you recognize you have a problem means you're not too far gone. The utilities recognize that demand charges aren't necessarily consistent with the EV charging business model. They recognize that. They don't necessarily know how to fix it. And so that's why we need to collaborate to find solutions that everybody can support. But the fact that they recognize it's a challenge is a good step in the right direction. Now it's about finding solutions that benefit the utility, the charger host, and the customer.
Yep. All right, folks. We've run out of time. I just like to wrap up by saying thank you all very much for spending an hour with us. If you want more information on our research or if you want to get more directly involved, please feel free to reach out. The more industry we have at the table, and other groups we have at the table, I think the better solutions we will come up with here. Quick last question: can we access these slides? And I would say,
yeah, we'll be making the recording of this available as well as the slides. So keep an eye open for the announcement, but we'll communicate directly with each of you that they're available, but they will be available on demand and for download whenever you want them.
All right. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the reminder, Nick. All right. Hope everybody has a great day and a great Thanksgiving, and you get to see all your families.